Welcome to our final couple of topics in forest ecology for this quarter. As promised, these next few ideas in ecology and their specificity to forest ecology tend to overlap quite a bit. We're going to be talking about community ecology and forest succession. We're going to use that to frame the topics of the class in the context of management, what we may be able to do to maintain these systems that we often rely on economically or for other resources. Okay, but right now what we're going to be doing is focusing on a couple of broader things, less management oriented to begin with. Just going to try to answer some big questions. How do communities get put together? What causes communities of plants to persist or to go extinct? We're going to be talking about community theory. How do these plant communities change through time, which is a whole other body of related science about succession, changes in plant communities over time. And then the other part of this that we cannot ignore is either punctuated moments or forces that happen over a long period of time which change the way forest communities are put together. I'm talking about disturbance in this case. So here are some examples of the things that we're going to focus on and try to develop a better understanding. Here is a desert oasis of Fremont cottonwood and some palms. This is in Joshua Tree National Park. How do you get this thing? How do you get this this kind of community that has high biodiversity in a desert that otherwise has very low diversity, or excuse me, very low productivity? And you can see that here in the foreground. The other is, here's another example. This is from the Philippines, tropical semi-montane forest with high biodiversity and high productivity. What influences how this is put together and maintained? And then some of the things that you might be thinking of when I say disturbance, such as fire. There's an example of one from Lee Vining a few years ago, and pathogens such as, or biotic agents of mortality such as pathogens, which unlike fire, which might kill many trees over a very short period of time, pathogens may kill many trees, but over years, decades, or even centuries. So let's look at these examples. Okay, now the first thing that I want to do here is I want to talk about the reading for this week. It sets up many of the topics that we're going to talk about, not all of them, but many of them. And it's often some new ideas for students in this class. What I'm going to do is give a short history of humanity with an emphasis on pre-Columbian North America and really how the history of humanity in North America has influenced forest dynamics. So let's just first focus on these learning goals. How did Homo sapiens become globally distributed? Let's try to answer that question. And what impacts did this have on North American forests? Okay, as best as we understand, this is the general history of humanity. Homo sapiens as a species evolved in sub-Saharan Africa and spread out across the world. I mean, give people credit. Highly adaptable. A highly adaptable species essentially has colonized every vegetated continent. And I'm excluding Antarctica in that case because though it has vegetation, it just doesn't have very much. Humans spread from Africa and into Eurasia, spread throughout Africa and into Eurasia. First people didn't have boats, and technology was developed pretty quickly with innovations such as the wheel and fire. But people spread across land masses before they spread across the oceans. Interestingly, some of the last places to be colonized by people were more remote, and those include New Zealand, which was harder to get to, harder to detect, harder to discover, and also the New World. And the reason for the difficulty in crossing over to the New World was because it was separated from Eurasia by a land mass with cold temperatures and a large body of water. However, when that body of water basically dried up during the last glacial maximum and creating this Bering Land Bridge, and people were able to walk across and then colonize the rest of the New World. One of the things I want to emphasize to you here is that people, Homo sapiens, actually ended up colonizing the eastern and probably northeastern parts of North America last. And this was in part because there was initially a large ice mass in this area, but also probably because it just took people time to cross the deserts and so forth. When Europeans arrived in North America, people were established in the east. Don't get me wrong, it's not like it was an empty land. There were plenty of people there, and they were managing forests and all kinds of other resources. But it was one of the last places to be colonized by people, from where, regardless of where they originated. So, this is just a map from Wikipedia about the Mississippian cultures, and I just want to make the point, and the paper that we read for this week makes it very well. There were many people living in North America, and even what's sometimes called a proto-civilization of Mississippian cultures. Some of these communities were quite large, at least tens of thousands of people with organized governments and systems of trade. It's thought that with enough time, there probably would have been nation states in North America, and unlikely systems of writing as had emerged in Mesoamerica as well. Anyway, when the Europeans arrived, there were quite a lot of people. The civilization largely collapsed after the very initial European explorers. It's unclear why this occurred, although it's likely it occurred due to disease. That meant that many of the Europeans who arrived in North America found a largely depopulated landscape. Now, I just want to distinguish that at the time Europeans arrived, there were a lot of people in North America, but there was a great event and significant collapse of the population. We don't fully understand why that happened, but it's clear that the populations were large and geographically extensive. That means that they would have been managing forests because it's an essential resource, and that sets the stage for everything that comes after. Here's this photo, or excuse me, it's not a photo, it's a photo of a painting by Soto when he arrived at the Mississippi. Soto, when he arrived at the Mississippi, he didn't look like this. He and his crew were probably starving, and he died shortly after. There were records from that exploration that did make it out, and they show that this is DeSoto, excuse me. There were a significant number of people there, but there was already upheaval because much of the population had been gone. Early reports suggest that there were large but abandoned cities in this part of North America. So when you look across North America, at least the United States, you see in the West Coast we have larger populations of people with indigenous descent. I'm from Arizona, grew up right here, right next to the Tonto Apache Tribe Reservation. This is the West had a great diversity of people that lived in it. Most people in Arizona now, there are Native Americans throughout society in Arizona. There are some very large reservations, and they influence the culture and economy of the state in a very significant way. Here's something that I'm particularly upset about. This is a proposed project to dam the Little Colorado, and I think that this is it should be an affront to just about everybody. This would flood parts of the Grand Canyon, and that's significant. But most importantly, this would flood several important. It's hard to say this in the right way, but irreplaceable, important spiritual locations in Hopi culture, and I really hope that this plan gets flushed down the toilet and never happens. So let's talk about California. California had hundreds of thousands of people living in it by the time that Europeans arrived. These people are still here. They are living, many of them live throughout California and throughout California society. You know, doing the things that you do, trying to make a living, you know, raise a family, and joining the military, going to college, you know, all that stuff, and also trying to carry on the legacy of their ancestors, in particular maintaining various cultural resources, whether those are worldview or religious, or are what I find is a very strong cultural identification with multi-generational land management. And here's myself and a number of colleagues trying to deal with some problems, maintaining cultural resources and natural resources in forests. We were out trying to survey stands for patterns of resistance to invasive species. This is a cool project, looking at going out into these culturally important sites and assessing forests for patterns of resistance to diseases. And it was a lot of fun. We did a lot, and sometimes it was crazy with the pole pruners getting away out of hand and all that. No one got hurt. So back to the point here. Pre-settlement, pre-Europeans times in California, the population of indigenous people was pretty large. It was diverse. There are really significant geographic barriers to communication across large differences, or even across small differences in California because of rivers, sharp mountain ridges, rugged terrain, all kinds of problems that kept people from necessarily sharing language or other resources. However, that wasn't always the case. Sometimes the languages are closely related, and people traded very extensively. It was a pretty interesting time. But there's a couple of things to kind of point out about this. One is that indigenous people society in California was largely decentralized. So you had villages, tribes, a shared language, a common worldview, but without necessarily a central government. Amazingly, or maybe not, land management was very effective during this time. I would argue that more effective than land management is at the scale of the state, despite a relatively small population and having that population decentralized. Essentially, people were able to burn, they were able to manage forests, they were able to burn them when they needed to. They didn't have to worry about electrical transmission lines, other critical infrastructure, and the situation, the whole management situation was different. But let's recognize this fact. The entire state's forest system was managed at this time. It can be done in a way that maintains fire-safe forests. At least it has been done in the past. Now, populations of California indigenous people collapsed through a series of events. Disease, some accidental, some possibly introduced intentionally. The mission system depopulated the landscape. And most tragically, and really hardest to talk about, it was a state-sanctioned genocide of indigenous people that occurred in the late 19th century. The result was that the landscape was largely depopulated, and indigenous management regimes collapsed. And what I mean by that is that we no longer had burning of land when the local populations needed them burned to maintain hunting, to improve collection of acorns, or for defense and other purposes. That collapsed, and it influenced the problems that we're dealing with today. That's where this is going. This history of California indigenous people has influenced the problems that we face today. Kind of one of the good things about this is that when you go up to Indian country in California, you find a lot of interest in burning, in particular, and indigenous people in California. People of indigenous descent are some of the leaders in getting fire back on the landscape. It takes a lot of work, takes a lot of determination, a lot of will, and there is that connection to the land, and that's a real asset in this case. Just kind of emphasizing again, a very diverse set of people. If you talk about just tribal affiliation or tribal groups, you can see that more or less all of the land was captured in one or another group's territory. And in some respects, the distribution of tribes and the number of tribes in any one particular area reflects biological diversity. There's a lot of biodiversity in the north part of the state, and that's because of isolation and rugged terrain and lots of resources and so forth. And there were lots of different tribal groups in the northwestern part of the state prior to European arrival. Here's just another another representation of that, and this is the California language groups. What you see in particular in the northwestern part of the state is they have this very high diversity of language. Many of these not very well related to each other. Athabascan is the, I think Algonquin, excuse me. Well, I've got this mixed up. Excuse me while I look to see where are the Yurok. The Yurok, and I always get it mixed up if it's Algonquin. Algonquin languages are more common on the East Coast, and this is one of the few representations of Algonquin language on the West Coast. It's kind of mysterious why it's there. But you can see the same kind of patterns that affect biological diversity, isolation, migration, possible founder effects, which is perhaps where the Yurok language, how the Yurok language got established in California. One group that establishes with a branch with the legacy of a particular language, and then that spreads from there. Anyway, this is kind of interesting because it's similar to other patterns of biodiversity. And just to emphasize again, there's a really significant leadership, significant innovation that's happening in California tribal communities up in Indian country in California related to fire and getting fire back on the landscape and trying to solve the state's problems using fire. No matter where you live, who you are, what your ethnic or cultural background is, if you live in California, you're having to confront fire in one way or another. If you're Indian, you have a connection to the land that is based on your ancestry and your ancestors. And it's not surprising that in a lot of respects, that there's this push to reestablish fire in order to maintain resources in ways that serve these communities best. Here are some of the examples of that. So, native foods. This is like one of the best community meals I've ever been to was one where we had the traditional tan oak mush and smoked salmon and some bread and stuff, and just like it was really good. And it was, the food says a lot about like a group of people in the place, and that was really great. Again, just the emphasis here is decentralized and but yet very effective management was possible given this group of people. Now, this group of people and their actions. Now, what was the consequence of this? What was the consequence of the loss of these people? Well, we've actually covered this already. During our section on fire, we talked about fire history and how it has changed in California over time. And let me just give you a reminder. This is a paper by Craig Lorimer, and it's a reconstruction of fire frequency prior to the genocide, and really prior to the establishment of the mission system. What we tend to see are very frequent fires, but fires that are do not tend to spread between sites. This graph is showing sites, and they're at different greater distances from each other. So if you look at fire in the past, and granted the fire histories are, they get less, we've less data as you go back in time because we lose information about these events. But what you see is that the fires do not tend to be as well correlated within sites or between sites. They're more frequent, and they just don't spread between sites or within sites always very well. Now, as you get later, particularly in this era, post 1850, post the gold rush and the California genocide, what you start to see are, as fire becomes less regular, but it becomes linked, more harmonized across within sites and across sites. So what's happening there? Those are likely lightning ignition fires, and without a maintenance of low fuel conditions, fire is more likely to spread between sites. And then later, what happens? Well, you get nothing, and that is not an error, that is real. So post 1900, 1910, we have a very strong federal response to suppress fire, and that has greatly influenced the fuels and fire problems that we face today. So the point of this reading here, and really this part of this week's lecture, is to emphasize how effectively people managed North America and how extensively they managed North American forests prior to the arrival of Europeans. And also to recognize that by changing those management regimes, those disturbance regimes, it has set up many of the problems that we face today and that we continue to struggle to overcome.